He thought he agreed to take one Apache wife. What showed up at his gate that night were 3 sisters, exhausted, hunted, and clinging to a rumor he never meant to spread. And in that split second under a dying sun, Silas Cole realized something. The life he'd built on solitude was about to be torn open and rebuilt with blood, trust, and something dangerously close to hope. Silas Cole slammed the last fence post into the dry, stubborn earth. His shoulders burned, his palms raw from a day's worth of labor beneath the unforgiving prairie sky. Out here, the work never really ended. It just paused long enough for a man to remember he was alone. The sun dipped behind the horizon like it had something to hide, leaving the sky streaked with the bruised colors of dusk. Silas exhaled slow. He was thinking about the black coffee left on the stove and the kind of quiet that didn't need words when movement caught his eye. Just beyond the fence line. 3 figures. Women. He froze. No one came out this far unless they were selling something, or running from something. They stood just outside the gate, close enough for him to see the fear in their posture, far enough to bolt if he moved wrong. His hand dropped near his holster, not out of threat, just habit. No riders behind them, no dust trail, just 3 shadows in the half-light, worn thin by the world. The eldest stood tall, or tried to. Her hair was tangled, her dress torn across the chest where she clutched it together with one trembling hand. But her chin was high, her stance protective. She wasn't there to beg. She was there to protect the other 2. The second sister, younger, had her fists half raised. Not quite a fighter, but not afraid to throw a punch. Her gaze locked on Silas like he was one more enemy waiting to break something. The youngest didn't hide her fear. Breath fast, dress ripped at the shoulder, dirt caked in the streaks left by old tears. Silas broke the silence, his voice low and even. "You lost?" The eldest shook her head once. "We come here. You say you take wife." He blinked. Weeks ago, some riders had passed through. Traders looking to offload an Apache girl, said she needed a safe place. Silas, needing help and seeing no harm in a quiet deal, had agreed. 1 woman. Just 1. A fair trade in a land where survival was measured in hands and trust. But this wasn't the deal. "I agreed to take 1, he said. "Not 3. The youngest flinched like she'd been struck. The second girl's jaw tensed so tight it looked painful. But the eldest, she didn't flinch. She just stared at him, eyes hollow with the kind of hope that already knew better. "We stay together," she said. "We not leave each other." He looked at them then. Really looked. Swollen wrists, rope burns, bruises on their collarbones, dirt crusted into their skin. They weren't running from bad luck. They were running from something worse. And he knew, God help him, if he turned them away now, they wouldn't make it till morning. The coyotes would find them, or the men they ran from would. Either way, it'd be death, or something worse. Silas had come here to bury the man he used to be. A soldier, a man who'd watched too many innocents fall and did too little too late. He had promised himself no more choosing sides, no more saving. But this wasn't about heroism. This was about not being a coward. His voice cracked through the quiet. "You hungry?" The youngest girl nodded before she could stop herself. He opened the gate. "Barn first. Water pumps inside. I'll bring blankets." The eldest swallowed hard. "Thank you," she whispered, like it cost her something to say it. They moved like ghosts, Tala leading, Kimi at her shoulder, Elu in the middle, barely upright. Inside the barn, lantern light cast long shadows. Horses stirred in their stalls. Silas laid out the blankets. My name's Silas Cole, the eldest replied, chin still high. Tala, she motioned. Kimi, Elu. You're safe for the night, he said. Tomorrow we figure the rest. He paused at the barn door, looking back. Tala's eyes met his, not pleading, just tired, but alive, and determined to stay that way. Back in his cabin, Silas sat in silence, the coffee untouched and cold. The fire cracked soft. He stared at the wall, listening to the wind. 3 strangers slept in his barn. He hadn't asked for this, but the frontier didn't care much for what a man asked for, only what kind of man he chose to be when the wind changed. And tonight, he'd made his choice. Call to action. If this story stirred something in you, don't just scroll past. Hit that subscribe button and stay for the next chapter. This land's just getting started. And so is the fight for it. Morning clawed its way across the prairie, slow and unkind. Frost still clung to the edges of the window pane in fine silver veins, and the stove gave off a low heat that barely chased the chill from the air. Inside the cabin, the smell of burnt oats lingered. Not enough to offend, just enough to remind everyone it was survival, not comfort, being served. Silas Cole moved with quiet purpose, setting down mismatched tin bowls while the sisters sat clustered around the table. Tala was watchful, her shoulders still squared like a woman ready to defend more than eat. Kimi's jaw held tension like a blade. Not sharp, but ready. And Elu, small and ghost-pale, blinked too often, like she wasn't sure this wasn't a dream that would turn on her. He ladled warm oats and laid out a hunk of hard bread. No one reached for it right away. Eat, Silas said simply, not unkind. It was Tala who moved first, waiting for his nod before she touched the spoon. Kimi followed, then Elu. The smallest girl's hands shook so much the spoon clinked against the bowl. She took one bite and froze, then another. And then the tears came, silent, shuddering. Silas turned away, pretended not to see. Dignity, he figured, was a thing even the wounded deserved. After a moment, he spoke. I need to know what you're running from. Tala set her spoon down. We weren't supposed to be here, she said, voice soft but clipped with restraint. Man said he would trade me. Said I was worth coin if I went to White Husband. Silas said nothing. She went on. My sisters, he said they were useless. Too young. Too much mouth. A flicker of humor might have crossed her face if the story weren't so raw. We left before he sold me, Kimi added, her voice darker. He tried to take Elu back. That made Silas shift. He looked closer at the girl. In the daylight, the bruises stood out sharp and purple on her arms, like rope had tried to claim her. His jaw tensed. Did he follow? Tala hesitated. We don't know. He has men. He always has men. Silas leaned on the counter, his fingers tapping slow. Someone twisted my name into that deal. I agreed to take in a woman, one woman, who needed safety and work. I didn't know you'd be 3. Kimi's eyes flared. You want us to go? No, Silas said, his tone final. But I need to know what kind of trouble's coming. I've seen what men like that can do. Elu whispered, voice hoarse. We don't want trouble. Silas knelt beside her chair, eye level, steady. You didn't bring trouble. You outran it. There's a difference. Tala watched him, something shifting behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something lighter than suspicion. We don't ask to stay forever, she said, just not to run again. He nodded. You're not slaves here, you're not burdens, but we've got rules. All 3 listened. We work, we watch, and if trouble comes, we don't flinch. Tala nodded first. "We know work. I can see that," he said, remembering how they'd carried themselves the night before. Formation tight like soldiers, even if they were falling apart inside. Kimi's voice broke the silence. "Then what happens now?" Silas stood, cracked the door, and scanned the horizon. Still clear. "Now we build something that can hold." The prairie wind rose slow and mean as they stepped out into the brittle light. Silas led them toward the corral, boots crunching dry earth. He handed Kimi and Tala a pair of thick gloves, worn but serviceable. Elu followed close, still unsure whether she was safe or just catching her breath before the next sprint. The back fence needed mending. Storms had pulled wire loose, posts leaned with age. Nothing poetic, just the bones of hard work waiting to be fixed. "You ever run fence?" he asked. Tala shook her head. "But we've patched roofs, built smoke pits, dug irrigation." "Good," he said. "This ain't any different, just bigger." He showed them how to loop the wire, how to set tension, how to check for rot at the base of each post. They picked it up fast. Kimi cursed once in Apache when a nail bit her thumb, but didn't complain. Tala worked quiet, eyes scanning the horizon every few minutes. Elu fetched tools, still too shaky to lift much, but determined not to be idle. Silas didn't speak unless he had to, but he watched. The way they moved together, fluid, alert, always in orbit around each other like stars pulled by gravity. Survival wasn't just instinct, it was practice. They weren't helpless, they were hardened. The kind of people you wanted on your land when the world started closing in. By midday, they'd replaced 3 posts and retightened a good stretch of wire. Silas took off his gloves, looked at them one by one. "You earned lunch," he said. Elu gave a tired smile. Small, real. As they walked back to the cabin, the wind kicked up dust across the plains, and Silas found himself looking over his shoulder more than once. Something in the air had shifted. Not danger. Not yet. But eyes. Somewhere out there, eyes were watching. The prairie stretched still and sun-stung by mid-morning. The fence line behind the barn looked straighter than it had in months, but the quiet that hung over Silas Cole's ranch wasn't peace. It was the kind that sets in before a storm decides what shape it's gonna take. Inside, the sisters moved with silent rhythm. Tala scrubbed the table with a rag she'd boiled clean. Kimi was boiling water and grinding beans, suspicious of every sound outside, but steady with her hands. Elu patched the torn sleeve of her dress, lip tucked between her teeth in concentration. The cabin, once hollow, now had breath in it. Movement, presence, sound. It was no longer just Silas's refuge. It was a secret. And secrets have weight. Silas poured coffee into an old tin mug and sat near the window, boots muddy from morning work, hat still on. His eyes drifted towards the southern ridge. The way he'd felt out there yesterday. Watchful, hunted, hadn't worn off. He took a sip. That's when he heard it. Hooves. Not in a rush. Casual. The kind of sound that didn't mean urgency, just interest. And interest in these parts could be more dangerous than bullets. He stepped onto the porch, one hand brushing the rifle, leaning by the door. A rider came into view from the north trail, young, lean, and carrying trouble in the way he slouched in the saddle. Amos Finch, neighbor of sorts. Big talker, sharp eyes, and always listening where he shouldn't. "Mornin', Cole." Amos tipped his hat, the horse pulling to a slow stop near the gate. "Thought I saw extra smoke yesterday. Visitors?" Silas kept his face calm. "Chimney's been acting up." Amos gave a grin, but his eyes flicked toward the barn, toward the water barrel. then the small stack of worn shoes drying by the wall. "Heard in town," Amos said, drawing the words out like a fishing line, "that there's 3 Apache girls gone missing from down south. Some trader in Hastings swearing up and down he had a deal go sour. Sheriff says they lit out north." Silas didn't blink. "I hear a lot of things," he said. "Doesn't mean they matter here." Amos shrugged, but there was a sharpened edge in it. "Just strange, you know? A man living alone all this time, then smoke, movement, whispers. Folks get curious." Silas let the pause stretch. Then his voice cut clean through the air. "I don't care much for gossip. You done riding circles, Amos? Or you looking to help mend a fence?" Amos's grin faltered for just a breath. "Nah, I'll keep moving. Just neighborly talk." He pulled his reins and turned, spitting dust behind him as he rode off. Slow enough to show he wasn't afraid. Fast enough to make it clear he'd be talking to someone else before sundown. Silas stood still until the dust trail vanished. Then he turned and stepped back inside. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Tala stood by the door, eyes locked on him. Kimi was near the window, hand tight around a knife she hadn't pulled. Elu sat small by the hearth, her needle paused mid-stitch. He saw nothing, Silas said, but he smelled something. Kimi let out a tight breath. "He'll talk." "He already is." Tala's voice didn't shake. "You lied." "I did," Silas said. "First of many, probably." There was no apology in it, just the truth, laid out like firewood. He wasn't proud of it, but out here, sometimes a lie was the only thing that kept a bullet from finding your door. Tala's gaze didn't waver. "That lie makes us all targets now." Silas stepped closer. "No, that lie buys us time. Time to prepare." Elu's voice, quiet and hoarse, broke through. "Why help us? Still?" Silas looked at her, then the other two. "Because I've seen what happens when no one steps in, and I've carried that weight before. I don't aim to do it again." They stood in silence a while, 4 people sharing the heat of one truth, the weight of one shared secret. Tala finally spoke. "We stay. We work. We face it if it comes." Kimi nodded. "No more running, not unless we must." Silas looked at them all. "Then we build this place like it's meant to hold." Outside, the wind picked up. The fence was tighter, the lines drawn. But now the land knew there was something hidden here. Something worth looking for. And once the frontier gets curious, it never forgets. The sun hung low in the sky, bright but mean, casting long shadows across the field where the fence line met the open land. Silas Cole worked with quiet intensity, hammering wire taut while sweat gathered under his collar. Just behind him, Tala held a new post steady, her shoulders trembling but locked firm. Kimi crouched by the gear sack, checking nails and tools with precise, clipped movements. Elu knelt in the dirt, handing Silas a coil of wire, like it weighed more than it did. The silence between them wasn't discomfort. It was focus. They'd settled into a rhythm born not of comfort, but necessity. Every hour of work bought them something. Structure, purpose, a chance to believe they weren't just passing through. But peace is never earned easy on the frontier. They heard the horse before they saw him. Slow hooves on loose dirt. Not a neighbor. Not someone passing through with good intentions. Silas straightened without turning. His hand dropped naturally to the hammer at his side. Not a weapon, but something solid. "Stay behind me," he said, voice flat. Tala froze, then motioned sharply for Elu to get low. Kimi slid closer to the fence, knife already tucked into her palm. The rider crested the hill at a casual trot, the kind that didn't care if you saw him coming. A black coat hung loose from his shoulders. Wide-brimmed hat, rifle slung across the saddle. The man's face was sun-leathered and tight, his eyes sharp and searching. Not a stranger to violence, not a man lost. This was a scout. This was trouble. This was Dutch, the kind of man who didn't ask questions unless he already knew the answers. He pulled his horse to a stop a dozen yards out, letting silence do the talking first. "Afternoon," he called, voice low and coated with fake politeness. Silas didn't move, didn't blink. "You lost?" Dutch smiled like a snake just before it strikes. "Just riding. Heard about some missing girls? Thought I'd check the edges. Never know what's hiding behind a new fence." Silas let the hammer fall into the grass. "That so?" "Yup. Town's buzzing. Lot of folks saying things. Thought I'd come see for myself." Behind him, Tala's breath hitched sharp. Kimi gritted her teeth. Elu huddled deeper into the shadow of the post. Silas stepped forward a single pace. "You're standing on my land. You got a name?" Dutch tipped his hat lazily. "Some folks call me Dutch. You?" Silas didn't answer. Dutch chuckled, slow and low. "Don't matter. I ain't looking to stir anything up. Just figure, if you saw anything unusual, you'd tell the sheriff. Friendly advice." Silas stared, unmoved. "I don't deal in rumors, or uninvited guests." The wind stirred the dry grass between them. Dutch's eyes scanned the fence line, lingering on the hammer, on the posts, on the freshly moved dirt. He wasn't just looking for the girls. He was measuring Silas, sizing up the kind of man standing between him and what he thought belonged to him. "Strange times," Dutch muttered, gathering his reins. "Shame when folks start hiding things. Makes it harder to stay neighborly." He turned his horse slowly, like he didn't expect to be shot in the back. And maybe he didn't. But his message was clear. He'd seen enough to be suspicious, not enough to move. Yet. As his silhouette shrank into dust, the stillness snapped. Tala let out a long breath, shoulders sagging. Kimi rose from her crouch, jaw locked. Elu wiped at her eyes with a dirty sleeve. Silas turned to them. He knows something, but not enough. Kimi spat into the dirt. "He'll be back." "Yeah," Silas said, "and next time he won't be alone." They stood in a circle now, 4 people and a secret too big to stay hidden. The prairie, once open and wide, felt smaller. The sky, heavier. Tala stepped forward. "We stand. We don't run." Silas looked at her. No fear, just resolve. "We stand," he echoed. He looked back toward the ridge, jaw clenched. Whatever came next wouldn't be gossip. It would be guns, questions shouted through smoke, the kind of violence that turned men's names to stone. But for now, the line was drawn, and no one crossed it without a fight. That night, the wind changed. Silas Cole felt it in his bones, in the quiet that settled around the ranch like a warning. Dutch's visit had shifted something. The sun had set blood orange, and the air turned thick with knowing, like the land itself was bracing. He walked the perimeter after supper, rifle slung over one shoulder, eyes scanning the fence line for signs of riders, shadows, or tracks that didn't belong. But it wasn't the wind or the fence he was watching. It was the silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Inside, the barn no longer felt safe. He opened the door slowly, not wanting to spook them. All 3 sisters looked up at once, Elu curled under a blanket of hay, Kimi sitting with her back to the wall, knife half hidden in her lap, and Tala standing watch, arms crossed. Silas's voice was low, but firm. "You're moving inside." Tala's brow creased. "Why?" Because Dutch saw enough to start sniffing. He'll be back, and you don't hide a war in a barn. Kimi straightened. You sure? No, Silas said. But I'm sure I don't want you out here when they come. He didn't wait for argument. He turned, left the door open. They followed him through the yard without a word, boots silent on the dry earth. The moon cast long shadows across the ground, their shapes stretched like ghosts heading toward judgment. Inside the cabin, Silas rolled out bedrolls near the hearth. He cleared the tools off the bench, made room for their things, even though they had none. He unlatched the rifle and leaned it by the door. Then he sat. It was the first time they were all inside together. The cabin was small. One room, one stove, one roof. Now 4 souls beneath it. No one spoke right away. The fire cracked softly. Elu sat near it, her arms wrapped around her knees. Kimi took the spot closest to the wall, her back never turned. Tala stood a while longer, staring at the flames, then finally lowered herself down opposite Silas. He poured coffee into 2 cups, one for himself, one for her. She didn't reach for it. Just let the warmth reach her through the quiet. He broke the silence first. You ever sleep under a roof that didn't feel like a trap? Tala's mouth twitched. Not a smile, but something like it. Once. What happened? Roof burned. We didn't go back. Silas nodded. I've had roofs collapse on me. Sometimes the ones you build yourself are the ones that fall first. Elu looked over. You built this one? Every nail, he said. Kimi asked, alone? Silas shrugged. Didn't plan it that way, just ended up like that. He stared into the fire for a moment, then spoke low. War stripped a lot of things off me. Friends, beliefs, trust. I came here with what I could carry and what I couldn't leave behind. Tala watched him. And now? Now I've got 4 people under my roof, and I don't sleep through the night, he said, half grinning, but only barely. The sisters didn't laugh, but the air shifted. Lighter, maybe. Real. Tala leaned back, resting against the bench. My father used to say, you don't pick your fire, just learn to carry the burn. Silas looked up at that. Smart man. She didn't answer, but something in her face said he wasn't around anymore. They fell quiet again, each one listening to the wind scrape the edges of the cabin, to the breath of those nearby. There was no talk of safety, no talk of trust. Just being there, alive, was enough. Elu fell asleep first, blanket tucked under her chin, her hand still gripping the hem like it might be pulled away. Kimi sat with her eyes half-lidded, blade still near, but no longer clenched. Tala stayed upright, long after the others quieted. Silas rolled out his own bedroll by the door. His boots off, gun within reach. Old habits didn't die, they just slept light. In the dark, Tala whispered, You don't owe us this. No, Silas replied, but I do it anyway. Why? He didn't answer right away. Then, because I've seen what happens when no one steps in, and I've done enough looking the other way to last a lifetime. Tala looked at him, firelight flickering in her eyes. Then we don't let it be for nothing. He nodded. Fair enough. The wind howled outside. Coyotes yipped in the distance. But inside, for the first time, no one was running. No one was begging. No one was alone. Just 4 lives, bent but unbroken, bound not by blood, but by the promise of not turning away. At first light, the prairie looked peaceful, gold-streaked and still, dust rising soft behind the cattle pens. But Silas Cole knew better. Peace out here was like silence before a gunshot. It didn't last, It only fooled the ones who wanted to believe the worst had passed. He saddled his gelding with methodical hands, checked the cinch twice, loaded his rifle, stashed it behind the saddle horn, and tucked a pistol into the back of his belt. He didn't plan on using them, but planning didn't mean much when trouble was already sniffing the wind. Inside the cabin, the air was tight. Tala watched him pull on his coat, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. Kimi stood near the stove, chewing the edge of a thumbnail, agitated, trying not to show it. Elu sat on the floor, legs pulled tight, face pale with unease. "You sure about this?" Tala asked. "I'm sure I need supplies," Silas replied. "Flour's down to nothing. Salt's thin. We're not going to make it through another week without going into Dry Creek." "You're walking into their teeth," Kimi said, voice sharp. "Dutch will be there." "Most likely," he admitted. "That's why I'm going alone." "No," Tala cut in, stepping closer. "That's why it's worse. You go alone. You got no eyes behind your back. I'll have mine open wide enough for two." It was supposed to be humor, but it didn't land. Tala's jaw clenched. "You trust the sheriff?" Silas let out a short breath. "Sheriff Tate's got a good spine, but not much reach. He'll keep town lawful, if the trouble knocks first and asks polite." Kimi looked ready to spit. "Dutch don't knock," Silas nodded. "That's why I ride quiet, in and out. No drink, no linger." He looked at Elu, crouched small by the fire. Her eyes met his. "What if they follow you back? Then they'll find out fast I ain't unarmed." He turned toward the door, pausing only when Tala stepped into his path. "You come back by sundown," she said. "No later." "I always intended to." He mounted up, boots snapping into the stirrups, and rode out without another word, because if he did, he might have turned around. And that wasn't an option. Back at the cabin, silence swallowed the space he left behind. The sisters didn't sit. They didn't rest. They prepared. Tala reinforced the shutters. Kimi stacked firewood near the hearth and double-checked the latch on the root cellar. Elu stayed near the table, oiling the rust off the old revolver Silas had left behind. She didn't know how to shoot it, not yet, but she held it like she meant to learn. By midday, the house was as tight as it could be. Still, the wind pressed through every crack like it carried voices. Every distant hoofbeat on the ridge sounded like it might not belong to Silas. Every bird startled from a tree brought Kimi's hand to her belt. Time stretched. Tala stood by the door with her arms crossed, eyes locked on the distant horizon. "This isn't hiding," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "This is choosing where to stand." Kimi joined her, knife on her hip. "I'd rather stand than run again." Elu didn't answer, but she moved to the window and didn't leave it, watching the empty trail as if willing it to fill with one man and a horse. Meanwhile, Silas rode into Dry Creek like a man who didn't want to be noticed, but knew he already was. The general store was half full. Conversation thinned when he walked in. Dutch's name didn't come up, but his shadow hung over the room like heat before lightning. Silas kept his words short. Flour, salt, a little coffee. No eye contact, no extra talk. He paid in coin, not trade. Outside, he crossed paths with Sheriff Tate, hat low, eyes wary. "Busy day," the sheriff said, chewing a toothpick. "Riding through," Silas answered. "Word says Dutch is sniffing after something that might be yours." Silas met his gaze. "Then Dutch is lying." Tate's eyes narrowed. "I don't doubt it, but lies gather men faster than truth out here." Silas nodded once, then mounted up and turned for home. He didn't look back. When the cabin came into view that evening, the sun already sinking, Tala was the first to spot him. Her shoulders dropped slightly, just enough to show she hadn't been breathing fully since morning. Kimi let the curtain fall. Elu smiled faintly and reached for the coffee pot. Silas dismounted. Slower now, the weight of what he'd seen pressing heavier than the supplies he carried. He stepped inside, set the sacks down, and looked at all three women. "They're stirring up," he said. "Dutch isn't hiding it anymore. He's calling you his property. Says you were stolen." Tala's face hardened. Kimi didn't flinch. Elu's hands clenched tight. "What now?" Tala asked. Silas looked around the cabin, at the walls, the rifle by the door, the three faces watching him not with fear, but with readiness. "Now we stop pretending they won't come," he said. "Now we get ready." The next morning broke quiet, but not calm. There was a pressure in the air, thick and metallic, like the breath before thunder. Silas Cole stood at the porch railing, one boot on the step, cup of black coffee cooling in his grip. He hadn't slept much. None of them had. Inside the cabin, Tala packed dried beans into jars with measured hands. Kimi ran her whetstone slow across a blade that already gleamed. Elu stitched quietly in the corner, the rhythm of her needle steady, though her eyes kept flicking toward the window. They were waiting. And they all knew it. Silas stepped inside and set the coffee down. "He's in town." Kimi's sharpening stopped. "Elu, you okay?" he asked. She nodded once, though her voice was thin. "We knew this day." Tala looked up. "What's he doing?" "Talking like you're something that went missing. Said you ran. Said you're his by contract. Some folks are listening. Most ain't saying." Kimi scoffed, low and bitter. "That's how it starts." Silas nodded. "The sheriff's not backing him, but law only stretches so far out here." Tala asked the question they were all thinking. "How long before he stops talking and starts writing?" Silas didn't blink. "Soon." That word hit harder than anything else that morning. They spent the day preparing. Kimi reinforced the windows with old planks pulled from the shed. Tala stacked water in the root cellar, filled buckets, tested the pump twice. Elu gathered blankets and made sure the lanterns were trimmed. She still wasn't strong, but she didn't ask to sit. Not once. Silas kept to the outer yard, checking fence lines, laying down brush where hoofprints might give warning. Every few minutes, his hand would rest on the butt of his rifle without realizing it. The land was theirs now, not by deed, not by law, but by stand. Near sundown, dust kicked up along the south trail. 2 riders. Tala saw them first, her voice low and calm. "They're coming." Silas stepped out, rifle in hand. The others stayed behind the door, watching through the slats like ghosts holding breath. The riders reined in at the gate. One of them was Dutch. The other, taller, broader, with a look that said he was used to getting paid for trouble. Dutch wore that same half-smile, all charm spoiled by what was behind it. "Well now," he called. "You're a hard man to reach, Mr. Cole." Silas didn't return the greeting. "You're trespassing." "Just making conversation," Dutch said, shifting in the saddle. "Heard you might be harboring some folks that don't belong here." "They belong exactly where they're standing." Dutch leaned on his horn. "See, that ain't what I heard. I got papers, I got witnesses, I got buyers waiting, and you're making it messy." Silas's voice was flat steel. "People aren't property, not here." Dutch chuckled. "That's a real noble stance, seeing as they ain't yours." Silas didn't budge. "They ain't yours either." The bigger rider muttered something to Dutch, but the wind carried it off. Dutch lifted one hand in mock surrender. "Fine," he said. Consider this your courtesy call, but next time we won't be friendly. You got till end of the week." Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Dutch spat into the dirt and turned his horse. As they rode off, Kimi stepped out from the cabin. She was already tying her hair back, jaw tight. "They'll bring more," Tala joined her. "They already have more." Silas looked at them both, then to Elu, who had appeared quietly at the porch with her arms crossed and eyes fierce. "No more hiding," Silas said. "We've got 4 walls, 4 souls, and 1 chance to make this line mean something." He walked to the gate, closed it, and slid the heavy bar into place. The sound echoed across the land. That night, the fire burned low but steady. The 4 of them sat near it, close, quiet, unafraid. Not because the danger had passed, but because they had finally chosen their ground. Tala spoke into the silence. "When they come, they'll come heavy." Silas nodded. "Then we stand heavier." No one disagreed. Outside, the coyotes cried, but inside, a different kind of pack was readying, one built not by blood or law, but by grit, promise, and something no man like Dutch could ever buy. By the time the first shot rang out, the sky was still pale gray, caught between night and day, like the world wasn't sure if it wanted to start breathing again. Silas Cole was already awake. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table with his back to the wall, eyes on the window, shotgun across his knees. He heard the shot cut through the stillness like a whip crack, and then the echo. Distant, deliberate. A warning. Tala was by the stove, her braid tight, rifle already in her hands. She looked at him without blinking. "They're testing the line," he nodded. "They won't stay quiet for long." Elu came in from the back with a bundle of blankets and jars of jerky tucked under one arm. "Cellar's stocked. Water's good." Kimi was already on the roof. She hadn't said a word since before first light. The ranch had become something else overnight. Not a home, not a hideout. A stand. And everyone inside knew it. Another shot. Closer this time. Tala moved to the window, slow and steady. "I count 6, maybe 7. "They know we're ready," Silas muttered, wiping his palms down his worn pants. "But they don't care." There was a silence that settled over the cabin, thick as the dust outside. Each of them carried it differently. Tala with stillness, Elu with quiet hands, Silas with the creak of his joints as he stood. But the weight was the same. Then came the voice, slimy, stretched thin over cruelty like honey over spoiled meat. "Dutch. Silas, don't tell me you're fool enough to bleed for them. I'm offering you a way out." Silas stepped to the door, but didn't open it. He raised his voice just enough. "You want them? Come take 'em. But you better be ready to pay more than silver." A pause. Then laughter, and the thunder of hooves. The attack came like wildfire, fast, brutal, noisy. Kimi fired first from the roof, dropping a rider before his boots left the stirrups. Tala and Elu were stationed behind the heavy table they'd flipped near the front window. Their aim wasn't panicked, it was personal. Silas moved like a man born in war, not just survival. Every step had purpose, every shot counted. The boom of his shotgun shook the floor. He wasn't protecting strangers anymore. He was defending kin. The barn caught fire first. Smoke billowed, the kind that stole breath and stung eyes. But no one retreated. They shifted, adjusted, fought smarter. Kimi rolled down from the roof when shots came too close, landing in the hay pile with grit in her teeth and blood on her temple. She didn't cry out, just crawled inside and loaded her next round. Dutch and his men circled, shouting curses and lies, calling the sisters by names that weren't theirs, trying to break something sacred. Didn't work. Hours passed, like years. When the sun finally cleared the horizon, Dutch had lost 3 men, 1 horse, and all his nerve. He screamed from behind a mesquite tree. "You think you won? You think this is over?" Silas stepped out the front door, rifle slung over one shoulder, boots blackened with soot. "No," he called back, voice hoarse, "but you're done." Another shot cracked, one last cry from the bush, missed wide. Dutch rode off limping, face pale, one arm pressed to his ribs, the rest scattered. The air fell still again. This time no one moved. Inside, the cabin was filled with smoke and broken glass. Elu had a gash across her leg. Tala's knuckles were split. Kimi lay flat on the floor, catching her breath, cheek bruised and lip torn. Silas lowered himself to the ground, back pressed against the door. He exhaled long and slow. They'd held. Not just the house. The line. Tala broke the silence, voice barely above a whisper. "They'll be back." Silas nodded. "Let 'em." And this time, when he said it, he didn't sound like a man hoping to survive. He sounded like one ready to finish it. The storm didn't come with thunder. It came with silence, the kind that hung thick in the rafters after a siege, the kind that made even a steady man like Silas Cole walk softer through his own home. The cabin still smelled of ash and gunpowder. Blood had dried where it fell, on the floorboards, on the broken window ledge, on Tala's sleeve. No one spoke of it. There wasn't a word in English or Apache that made it any easier. Elu moved with a limp, her leg wrapped in torn cotton and pine salve. Kimi had a bandage across her brow and had taken to sleeping with one eye open, back to the wall. Tala barely sat still. Her hands worked constantly, fixing the door hinge, rewrapping the guns, carving small grooves into the edge of the table with her knife. Marks of days, or names. Silas didn't ask. He kept to chores, rebuilding the barn roof one slat at a time, rubbing down the horses, watching the trail with a loaded Winchester slung across his chest. But inside, something gnawed at him. That night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, he found her by the doorway, Tala staring out into the dark. "They'll come again," she said, not turning. "Not Dutch, but the others." He nodded. "Maybe. They don't quit, men like that." Silas stepped beside her, voice low. "No, but I've seen him bleed." She studied him, her gaze sharp, searching. "You could leave," she said. "Pack up. Be gone by dawn. They'd follow us, not you." It was quiet between them for a long breath. Then he said, "I left once. It didn't make me free." She looked away. "Then what does?" He answered without hesitation. "Staying put." By week's end, the ranch was half whole again. Kimi patched the fence line. Elu stitched fresh curtains from an old feed sack. The days had a rhythm, hard and honest, stitched together with dust and sweat. But it didn't feel like safety. It felt like waiting. Until one morning, when the dog barked and hooves hit the road. 3 riders. One bore a badge. Tala was already behind the wagon, rifle braced. Kimi dropped into the tall grass with a blade in her boot. Elu watched from the porch, shoulders tense. Silas stepped out first. The sheriff, new face, long mustache, silver star crooked on his chest, lifted his hand. "Name's Harris. Heard there was trouble here. Some fellas didn't come back from a ride out west of Mesita. Thought I'd ask a few questions." Silas didn't blink. "You askin' or accusin'?" The sheriff smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Guess that depends on what I hear." Before Silas could speak, Elu stepped forward, We shot in self-defense. The sheriff's head tilted. They came for us, she said. Like property, like meat. We stopped them. Tala joined her. We got names. Dutch Marin, Saul Petty. They trade women, Sheriff. You know that name? Sheriff Harris didn't answer right away. But something in his face shifted. A flicker of truth too ugly to say aloud. I ain't here for them, he muttered. I'm here 'cause there's noise. Folks in town talking. Papers say you're murderers, savages. Tala's face hardened. And what do you say? He paused, looked at Silas, then back at her. I say, I didn't see anything. He turned his horse. You folks keep quiet. Keep to yourselves. Maybe this place don't make the wrong kind of news again. And just like that, they were alone again. That night, rain came. Not heavy, not long, but enough to patter on the roof and wash the blood from the dirt. Silas stood under the eaves, letting it hit his hat, soak through the shoulders of his shirt. Behind him, the fire crackled soft. The sisters sat close, shells in their laps, weaving them into new beads, into color. Kimi laughed once, just once, but it filled the room. Tala came to the door, her face unreadable in the dark. You ever wonder what kind of man you'd have been if they never came to your door? She asked. Silas looked out into the rain. Every damn day. And? He turned to her. I think maybe I was waiting on someone to give me a reason to stay. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. Instead, she said, The land remembers what you plant. Silas tipped his hat. Then I hope it remembers this. The rain fell gentle, steady. Not a cleansing. But maybe a promise. Spring came quiet, like it was unsure if it belonged there. The frost lifted from the field in slow curls of steam. The dry earth softened. Grass pushed through where ash once laid. For the first time in a long time, the ranch didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like something that might outlive its scars. Silas Cole stood at the edge of the property, boots planted in tilled soil, hands resting on a fence he'd rebuilt board by board. The cabin behind him still bore the marks of the siege, patched bullet holes, a crooked shutter. But life had come back around, in its own unhurried way. Elu's laughter carried across the field, light and free. She rode in clumsy, happy loops on a paint mare too big for her frame. Kimi ran beside her, breathless but smiling, hollering corrections in Apache and broken English. Tala stood by the well, skirt hiked, arms sunk deep in a bucket of seed. She worked quiet and focused, lips moving to a tune Silas didn't know. Something soft, sung in her mother's tongue. The kind of song that didn't need an audience to matter. He didn't interrupt, just watched. Like a man still trying to understand how he got to witness peace. That afternoon, a rider came. Not a lawman, not a slaver, just a dust-covered man from town with a government seal and a paper envelope. Silas took it at the gate. Tala opened it. It was official, typed and signed. A notice of release. The charges dropped. Her name cleared. No bounty, no warrant, no further inquiry. Freedom, written in someone else's hand. She stared at it a long moment, then folded it once and placed it in a wooden box with a broken lock. That paper don't tell me who I am, she said, soft. Silas didn't press her. He only nodded, as if the earth had said something worth listening to. The next morning they walked together up the ridge behind the cabin just before sunup. All four of them. No rifles. No fear. At the top, the valley spread out below. Red earth, green shoots, and fences stretching like stitched scars. It was theirs now. Not by law, not by blood, but by labor, by sweat, by the choice to stay. Silas looked at Tala. Her hand found his. It was instinct now. Not something borrowed, not something bargained. "I guess the mountain made its choice," he said. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "We did." Below, the girls ran ahead, their footsteps pounding dry dirt, sending little clouds up into the wind. The breeze caught a wooden signpost they'd nailed at the gate. It rattled gently. Faded lettering carved by Tala's knife read, "No one owns the wind." They didn't rebuild the walls higher. They didn't run when new riders passed the trail. They didn't wait for the next bad thing. Instead, they planted more, and trusted that someday what they planted might grow roots deeper than the fear. And maybe that's the real story of the West. Not just about guns and grit, not about outlaws and sheriffs, but about people choosing to stay when they could have run, choosing to trust when trust had no reason left, choosing to build something where only ruin stood. Isn't that what home is? Something made, not inherited, something chosen. If that quiet defiance means something to you, if this story stayed with you, consider staying with us. Subscribe for more stories born of dust, blood, and something worth protecting.